Okay, look, I've been feeling this tension as we're going through the physical violence that starts to happen to Jesus, this crossing of the Rubicon moment where we go from Jesus being untouched and unscathed to punched in the face and then roughed up and then flogged and then publicly humiliated and taken on his way to the cross. And there's just a certain tone that I think you have to strike when you're talking about something like this with a character like Jesus that has to involve a degree of respect, because this is crazy stuff. It's injustice. It's sorrowful. At the same time, though, when we talk about some of these practices in general, I think the only way to really get through it without losing our minds is a little bit of gallows humor. And what we're talking about today is the ancient world, and particularly the Roman notion of execution, the role it played in society, and specifically the different torture methods and execution methods they used for different offenses so as to make particular points. Some of them are so offensive that I think I can only use euphemisms given how broadly acceptable for all ages audiences I want this program to be. But the Romans did not invent cruel and unusual punishment. In fact, everybody did cruel and unusual punishment up until very recently. It was very weird and innovative in our founding documents, our being the United States of America, to preclude cruel and unusual punishment. The idea there was that now we're going to be a society of laws, and through civic virtue and checks and balances and the separation of powers, we are going to handle our business and deal with really broken, messed up stuff that happens in society without having to resort to these cruel punishments that date all the way back to forever. Now, obviously, in Matthew 27, Jesus is about to be, or is in the process of being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment meant to make a point and bring about shame for him, his family, anybody who would associate with him, and it's meant to send out a warning. I mean, these same Romans crucified on pikes however many slaves along with Spartacus, the former slave from Thrace, who was the gladiator who rose up in the Third Servile War, and he and everybody who rose up with him, they were famously crucified along the way by the Romans to make a point, as a cautionary tale, a word of warning to anybody else who might think about rebelling in a similar way. That's how we have to think about these ancient torture and execution methods. They're meant to accomplish all those things, but probably the biggest one is that it's meant to make anybody who would think about rebelling or causing problems realize you're not just going to die if you resist the authority. You're going to suffer immeasurable, complex, humiliating pain that will be absolute torture for the people who love you to watch if they themselves are not tortured. Going back to Assyria, you have unbelievable amounts of clever cruelty, and the Assyrian rulers, remember these are the people who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, they boast in stone inscriptions of the horrible ways that they tortured their fallen opponents, cutting out tongues and eyes and cutting off limbs and allowing them to die slowly in the sun. But then eventually after them along come the Persians, and the Persians, by comparative standards, look really gracious. The Persians are well known for evolving into a policy of, hey, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. They would rather pay you with gold for your loyalty and let you do your own thing than torture you and punish you and then brag about it. But even the Persians had their methods. Very famously, there's a story about a later Persian king, Artaxerxes II, who got into a dust-up with his brother called Cyrus the Younger. This isn't the Cyrus the Great who conquered Babylon in the book of Daniel. And Cyrus the Younger ends up getting killed at a very famous battle, the Battle of Cunaxes, something we will talk about when we get into our series on Esther that's coming up next. But in the aftermath and the fallout from this battle between brothers, the Battle of Cunaxes, or Cunaxa, in 401 BC, we hear about this character named Mithridates, who apparently struck Cyrus, knocked him down, and then another guy injured him in the leg. And this Mithridates character was like, hey, I did what I was supposed to do. I killed that rascal Cyrus who we were fighting against. But Cyrus's brother, his opponent, he still cared about his brother. And the ranking members of Artaxerxes II's court knew that he still cared about his brother, and Artaxerxes II didn't take kindly to this guy boasting about defeating his brother and his enemy in this battle. And so King Artaxerxes II devises this elaborate torture method to make an example of Mithridates for raising his hand against noble blood, for killing Cyrus the Younger. And Plutarch, the later Roman historian, gives us this description. The king, Artaxerxes II, decreed that Mithridates should be put to death in boats, which execution is after the following manner. Taking 2 boats, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, you wedge him in there so that he's stuck between them. Then you offer him food, and if he refuses to eat, they forced him to do it by pricking his eyes. Then after he's eaten, they drench him with a mixture of milk and honey, pouring it not only into his mouth, but all over his face. Then they keep his face continually turned toward the sun, and it becomes completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that settle on it. And as he's stuck between the boats, he does what those who eat and drink must needs do, and goes to the bathroom, and then creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement and chew their way into the bowels of him, and his body is consumed. When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon, and as it were, growing to his inwards. In this way, Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired. Look, I'm not going to take you through every horrible thing that every ancient people group did, but I give you this example and this background to make the following point. Rome didn't just appear on the scene and come to prominence in the 3rd century BC, way out west, as Greece and Persia are kind of finishing off their fighting. And then just boom, Rome suddenly has to manage a government, and they have to kill people in clever ways to keep people loyal, so they invent a whole bunch of new things. No. Rome is the inheritor of Western civilization, including being the inheritor of all of these global traditions for how you punish people. Rome doesn't have to invent most of their punishments because the meaning of those punishments is already known all around the world because of the imperial activities of the Egyptians, of the Assyrians, of the Babylonians, of the Persians, of Alexander and his generals who came after. So Rome then is just latching on to the quote-unquote best, but let's put it another way, most horrifying torture and execution techniques because the advertising work has already been done by everybody else. Rome then isn't the originator of these horrifying practices. Rome, rather, is the perfecter and refiner of these horrifying practices. And this reign of terror, this threat that looms over all the people under the banner of the empire, is something they depend on heavily to keep things in order through brute force and horrifying public violence. Understand, that is the system, that is the thinking behind what is happening to Jesus in Matthew 27. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's not happening in a bubble. And if we understand it in the grander sense, we better understand how the original audience would have felt about this, how they would have responded to this, and what the crucifixion really means at the deepest level. I'm sorry, but we've got more torture to cover coming up tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.